there were roughly 40,000 dead lying on the battlefield. That was just an incredible level of lethality created by artillery and firearms that by today's standards are really very primitive, but nonetheless were able to inflict that kind of damage. We see this lethality increase through the 19th century. By the time you get to Königgrätz in 1866, the great collision between the Prussian and Austrian armies, the casualties are even greater, and you're now talking about breech-loading rifles, breech-loading artillery, steel guns. It's a disaster in human terms. The carnage is beyond belief. As we move towards World War I, we get to the Russo-Japanese War, and the casualties the Japanese take at Port Arthur against the Russians are phenomenal. Thousands upon thousands of people being mowed down by machine guns, artillery, now grenades. You're now into a blast-centric battlefield. It's not just standard artillery, but mines and so forth. So the lethality continues to increase, but the nature and the structure of the organizations fighting really doesn't change very much. And the solution in the minds of most commanders is to actually increase the density of human beings on the battlefield, to somehow or another compensate in a human sense for this dramatic increase in firepower. So the point is, how you choose to look at things really shapes where things are really going to go, as opposed to where they probably ought to go. Had we looked carefully at what happened between 1815 and 1914, we probably would have reached different conclusions. So what I want to do is to try and get people to surf the wave a little bit better. In other words, look at where the true technology and destructiveness of warfare is headed, and appreciate what that means for the United States Army. Many of you will know this man, George Kennan. And George Kennan is probably one of the first people to articulate very effectively the enormous problem in American national military strategy. That problem is largely, but not exclusively, but largely the absence of any coherent framework that links the use of military power to realistic, attainable political goals. In fact, Kennan's observation was, we tend to do things overseas, beyond the borders of the United States, this is after the Second World War in Korea, not so much because we have to, because we need to, but because we are doing things that make us feel better about ourselves. We, after all, are the exceptional nation. We are the pristine example of the pinnacle of Western civilization. We live in a state of perfection. Just ask the Marine Corps. So the point is, Kennan was saying, look, this is not necessarily strategy. Most of what we do is not shaped by the need to do something, but by the capability to act. Recall Madeleine Albright in the early 1990s, who confronted, at the time, General Colin Powell and said, listen, you keep talking about this wonderful army. What are you doing with it? And he was, of course, stymied by this statement, but her point was, American values are universal. Everyone can share our values and benefit from our values. And we need to export these values, and we want to use the United States military establishment to do it. And remember, in the aftermath of Desert Storm, there was this illusion of invulnerability, invincibility, of the United States enjoying a monopoly of power like no power had enjoyed, certainly since the Roman Empire. So the assumption was, we now have both the capability and this God-given right, if you will, to use the capability to export America to places that desperately need it. Now, places that desperately need it turn out to be opportunities that present themselves, places where we think we can tinker and get away with it, usually against adversaries who are very, very weak and not very strong. Sometimes we miscalculate. We certainly miscalculated in Vietnam. But the point is, that's not strategy. That is not tied to a national security strategy that drives a military strategy. So in the absence of any coherent strategic framework that defines national interests in tangible, concrete terms, and then ties a force design to those interests, what do the armed forces do? They essentially do whatever the generals and the admirals think is appropriate. And in bureaucratic terms, for the last 50, 60 years, that has largely meant defaulting to a force structure, a force design, and an approach to war with its roots in the Second World War. Now, that's not entirely unreasonable, because stop and consider for a moment that the last major event of a military nature that actually changed anything in the international system fundamentally was the Second World War. None of the interventions that we've involved ourselves in or have involved others since 1945 have fundamentally altered that system. Some would say that World War II ultimately continues until 1989 and then ends with the collapse of the Soviet occupation of Central East Europe. And that's unbelievably accurate, frankly. But the point is, that too is tied to the Second World War. So the profound tectonic shifts in the international system really go back to the Second World War. Nothing has fundamentally changed in profound terms since then. But we have, nonetheless, expended enormous blood and treasure all over the world with the object of changing things. And that was Kennan's observation. He simply said, it's wrong-headed, it's wasteful, and it should stop. But no one seems, at least until this point, to have come up with an answer as to how to stop it. But I think we're getting close. And the answer is, we don't have any more money. We can't continue. We've put ourselves in phenomenal debt. And so, like any great power, like the British Empire, like Rome, like many of our predecessors, we are going to simply walk away from large numbers of places where we have been for a very long time because we can't afford to stay. We're just going to pick up and leave. That doesn't mean we exit the stage. And in the case of the United States, that doesn't change our interests. Remember that we are of necessity, as an American people, first and foremost, a global aerospace power. We are of necessity a global maritime power. We are not a global land power, nor do we need to be. Because like the British Empire that spawned us, we are effectively an island nation. We are protected by the Atlantic. We are protected by the Pacific. We keep a watchful eye on those Canadians, of course. And to our south, in the Caribbean basis, we have a disaster, which I'll talk about later on, which does present a threat of types and kinds. But the point is, we have not had to deal with force on the continent that threatens our existence. We are not Germany sitting in the middle of the continent that has to deal with the very real prospect, or has had to deal for many, many centuries, with the prospect of invasion from various forces from the east, the west, the south. We are not Russia. We do not have this massive border in 1/6 of the world's land mass that is open to potential invasion from large numbers of people who are, quite frankly, unfriendly to Russians and dangerous. And the same thing, by the way, holds true for China. We're very different. We are an English-speaking people. And for that reason, we tend to see the world through a different lens. And for that reason, we have never maintained, for long periods of time, large standing armies. So now we have what is really an existential crisis for the Republic in financial terms. And that existential crisis is not limited in a political sense to the people in Washington that brought this on. This existential crisis now confronts the United States Armed Forces, and more particularly, the United States Army. So we're going to have to answer some tough questions about the future. The key thing to remember, however, is that from now on, I suspect, over the next 10 years or more, Eisenhower's mantra at the top, where he talks about the criticality of security and solvency and having both, will be adhered to. It's going to be a struggle, but we're going to get there. I don't have any solutions to the economic problem, and I'm not up here to tell you what should be cut and how we cut things, although occasionally I do talk about economics because remember Galbraith's famous observation about economics and economists in general. They exist to make astrologers look professional. He's right. So, pick your economist and you can get whatever answer you'd like. From my vantage point, it's obvious we're going to have to reduce spending. How we do it, when we do it, that's another matter, but it's coming. It's unavoidable. That's part of the wave that Bill Gates mentioned. How do we surf this wave as it comes headed straight for us And by us, I mean the U.S. Armed Forces and the Army. Now, this is enormously important. These are the questions that are not, I frame them here for the Army generals, for the Army 4-stars. But these are questions that everyone in the United States Armed Forces ultimately has to deal with. And these are the questions that no one really wants to answer. And if they do answer them, the answer is, why, what we're doing right now is fine. There's no reason to change. Everything is fine. Look, we have been successful everywhere for 50 years, haven't we? Why change? I remember Michael O'Hanlon. You've all seen him on television. He was one of the most severe critics that I had to confront when Breaking the Phalanx was published, because his statement was, well, MacGregor's written an interesting book, but, the burden is on him to prove that anything should change in the Army after the Titanic victory over the Iraqis in 91. Of course, my own view of the Titanic victory over the Iraqis is we could have done it with 50,000 men in a week and being much more successful and much more effective, but we had this inflated view of our enemy, and we tended to walk away from that experience with an inflated view of ourselves. But nonetheless, that was the O'Hanlon response, and that has been the status quo response inside the Defense Committee in Washington for a long time. First, you have to look at the current strategic environment, be realistic about it. Don't see it through an ideological lens. Stop thinking in terms of, well, we have to rush to Libya to save people who are allegedly on the verge of being slaughtered by their evil dictator. That kind of thing is just not affordable for the future, and it's largely unnecessary, I would argue. And I would also argue, based on my experience with the Kosovo air campaign, it's a blatant lie. Saddam, our friend in Libya, the crazy man, Muammar Gaddafi, was not preparing to slaughter thousands of people. Just utterly false. Just as there was no evidence before we started bombing in Kosovo that the Yugoslav army was going to go and slaughter thousands and thousands of Albanians either. But these things were said to stiffen support, build support, mobilize support for actions that the American people under normal circumstances would never take. We've got to look at that environment realistically. I think if you look at it, you can escape the conclusion that today, and certainly for the next 10 years, maybe longer, there is no existential military threat to the United States. That doesn't mean there aren't any threats, but there is no existential military threat to the United States.